talk by Dr. Marike van Aerde, who is going to speak to us on routes of exchange, routes of connectivity. And this topic this talk will tell us about the archaeology of ancient India's trade networks. I think this is a very interesting topic, also relatively new for the Vivekananda International Foundation to explore this. We have an ongoing project on ancient India, which is being spearheaded by Professor D.K. Chakravarti. Perhaps you know him.
By name only, yes.
Yes, he's a leading archaeologist and he's now Professor Emeritus at Cambridge University. But also he spends time at the Vivekananda International Foundation. We have already published, I think, about 8 volumes, and 3 volumes are under preparation. So very interesting work on Indian history has been done, and he's an archaeologist, so there is a natural bias towards archaeology. We want to investigate how India was connected with the rest of the world. So I think your talk would be very interesting for us. And I think it's also very important that India, which is now at the cusp of a economic growth, its global profile has risen, and it's but natural that we should focus on our history. There is a lot of interest outside India also as to what India is, where it is going, and so on. As a part of those conversations, I think trying to understand India is very important for our foundation. And that's why we focus on history. The debates on history can be quite subjective if we do not have knowledge about ourselves, which is based on some facts. And I think archaeology is the ultimate in terms of unearthing facts about a country. So it's an extremely important discipline. And Archaeological Survey of India, of course, does a lot of research and has done a number of excavations and added to the knowledge about India. But perhaps we need to invest more in Archaeological Survey of India, more studies, more finds, and so on. As a result of recent finds, and we have now new light shed on Indian history, particularly, this theory about Aryan migration that has now been questioned. There's a lot of work which is also being done on the sites connected with the Ramayana and Mahabharata and so on. So archaeology becomes very important. Of course, archaeology, now new technologies are also being used in the archaeological work, and that's also an interesting that's a very interesting methodologies are being used today in archaeology. So we'd like to hear from you on that. So let me welcome you all and also briefly introduce the topic and the distinguished speaker we have. This talk by Dr. Marike van Aerde is connected with her project, Routes of Exchange, Routes of Connectivity. And it is a global project, I understand, a project on global connectivity. And as a part of that, she has been studying India's connections with Africa. So she's going to talk about India's Indian subcontinent and East Africa, how they were connected during the period 300 BCE to 800 CE. So that would be very ancient India. And this particular project is also examines data sets across the Indian Ocean region. And the project is interdisciplinary, and it uses several scientific methods such as ceramic studies, chemical analysis, satellite, LiDAR, and database analysis, etc. Dr. Marike is a well-known expert, and she appears in international conferences and actively pursues open access and international heritage initiatives. She's working together with a number of universities and institutes in India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Egypt. And from 2019 to 21, Dr. Marike held simultaneous lectureships at the Faculty of Archaeology and the Ancient History Department in Leiden. In 2021, she set up a heritage field work in the Karakoram Mountains of Pakistan. So, and she has also collaborated with several global institutions, the Royal Dutch Institute of Rome, the British Museum in London, and she holds a master's degree from Redbourne University. So, Dr. Marike, we welcome you, and I also want to mention here Rishika Dhumal, who is a research associate with us. And I want to thank her for introducing Dr. Marike to the VIF and also for organizing this particular talk. So now over to Dr. Marike.
Thank you very much for this great introduction, and also your introduction on archaeology in India and the relevance, and I completely agree with this. So today I will show some case studies and examples from my research project, Roots of Exchange, Roots of Connectivity, and where Rishika is a PhD student as well. And I'm going to try and give both a broader scope as well as some details of some of the work we have been doing, with main focus on the Indian subcontinent and how this can be integrated into wider research perspectives. So hopefully the slide works. You should see the second one now. I can't see what you see, but otherwise let me know. Here you see some of the international students, PhDs and master students from our project at work in the lab, out in the field. And again, to briefly summarize, the main aim of our project is to reconstruct trade routes from East Africa to the Indian subcontinent based on factual archaeological data. A lot of historical studies that exist or were written in the past focus mostly on sporadic textual sources, and there's still a lot of archaeological material that has not been examined. So we have quite a large variety, therefore, of researchers with PhDs looking at ancient Indian ports, mostly from around the Maurya to Gupta era, but also trans-regional distribution of evidence in East Africa, and we use scientific methods specifically and statistically viable data. I myself, my PhD was about ancient Egypt, and this is actually how I came to be interested in India, because so much material, trade material, came from the Indian subcontinent, and very few people had actually investigated this. So over the years, since my doctoral research, I got more and more involved with Indian archaeology, and therefore it also got an important place in this project. So the main things that we focus on, just to briefly summarize, is to connect individual sites. A lot of archaeologists still focus often on one individual site and they publish it very thoroughly. But the important thing to understand India's connection with the rest of the world and trade routes is to connect different sites, compare them over large distances so that you can see patterns emerge. Very important here is to have clear and well accessible archaeological data and to supplement textual sources. Usually because archaeology is much more numerous, we have more materials, and some of the textual sources are also subjective, of course. They're written by people with third-hand reports. And often, very interestingly, we find that some archaeological finds can also contradict what texts say. So both are important. In this way, by connecting individual sites and seeing new patterns emerge, we can also identify potential new sites and new areas of interest. And this is also something that we have done with the project. We followed these patterns and identified potential new sites or started actual new research. So there is also quite a lot of room still for innovation with these methods. Very important, I have found, is international collaboration. In Western sciences, here in Europe, in the UK and the United States, ancient history is still very focused on Greeks and Romans and Europeans. Whenever I teach a lecture on ancient India and I mention the Maurya Empire, most students have never heard of this. Of course, it was a very prominent empire in antiquity. So collaboration with archaeologists actually from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, where a lot of expertise is, a lot of great work has been done, I think is very good for the academic global community, because we can all, of course, learn from each other. And this is something we've been doing in our project as well. So to highlight some of our work, I will give 4 brief case studies. First, we'll have a look at maritime trade, what we have been doing here over the past years. Then I'll highlight briefly a specific case study on South Indian beads, very small beads that actually can have quite a scope in a historical sense. And I will also elaborate on some land trade routes in Himalayas where we have had a recent fieldwork project. And based on these case studies, I will very briefly share some interesting future prospects, which in a post-COVID world could lead to a lot more interesting fieldwork. And of course, I would also really look forward to your feedback and ideas about this. So to start on the maritime routes, of course, when we look at the Indian Ocean, my very high-tech red circle on the map here, it of course makes very much sense that the Indian subcontinent is so important in this region, and where we have the African coast, the Arabian Peninsula, and then you have the entire west coast of the Indian subcontinent, very prominent for all the exchange that happened across this major ocean throughout antiquity. But also from around the 1st century BCE, especially, the northern parts of the subcontinent also become very important for land trade routes. And through the Himalayas, we see evidence of one of the first land routes that opens to China when we have the Han Dynasty in China. And this is the 3rd case study. We'll look at some of the archaeological and rock art remains about these routes as well. And so in a sense, you could say the Indian subcontinent was a crossroad, was sort of a central point in the ancient world, much more than Greece or Rome, which are very much in the outer edges of the West. But India, ancient India, and Sri Lanka was at the center of it all. And this is something that we also see more and more in the archaeological evidence of the subcontinent, but also very much along the East African coast. And there's still so much to discover. Now, one of the main textual sources that in the past people have used to reconstruct routes across the Indian Ocean is the Periplus Maris Eritreae, which is a Roman text written in Greek, and it describes multiple ports along the Indian west coast and some of the goods that have been traded there. But a lot of the information in there is actually incorrect. For example, the author of the text has never traveled across the Indian Ocean, doesn't know that Sri Lanka is an island, mistakes a lot of the locations. And at least here in Anglo-Saxon literature, still this text is considered the main source of information about Indian Ocean trade. And it is definitely an important source, but it is by no means the only one. And very interestingly, a lot of archaeological data also contradicts some of it. So that's one reason why archaeology matters, especially in this field. Even today and last year even, publications from Oxford, Cambridge focus predominantly on what they call Indo-Roman trade. So connections between the Roman Empire and India. Of course, the Roman Empire only really came to power around 30 BCE. So that's 300 years after the Maurya Empire. And at this time, the Romans take over the ports in ancient Egypt. But the archaeological evidence actually shows that already long before that time, hundreds of years before the Romans control the African ports, we already have many evidences of trade coming from the Indian subcontinent across the Indian Ocean. And so this Roman focus is something that is deeply rooted in Europe. Also many of the British archaeologists in the 19th century who did excavations in India, they were very much focused on the Romans rather than India's role. And I actually wrote a review on the recent book by Federico De Romanis, which is coming out next month, in which I also argue that we need to look beyond just Roman papyri, but we have to look at the actual archaeology as well. When this comes out, I would also be happy to share this with you. And there's still a lot of work to be done in this area, and I really hope that our project and also especially the young people working in this project can contribute more to that. To give one very striking example of how archaeological evidence can really change our knowledge and our view of Indian ports is the very famous site of Arikamedu in the south, of course, near Pondicherry. And this was first excavated by Mortimer Wheeler, a British archaeologist who found 38 sherds of Roman Maritime pottery made in Italy. You see some of the old pictures here on the slide. And based on the find of 38 of these sherds, he wrote that Arikamedu was a Roman port. It was a Roman trade emporium, and this very much was one of the instigations for the fact that still now many people believe or write in the history books that it was the Romans introduced trade to India. However, later excavations and archaeological studies by Indian archaeologist Vimala Begley and several others have noted that at this site there were 300,000 other pottery sherds, and none of them were Roman. They were all Sri Lankan, South Indian, or Arabian. And these were ignored in the interpretations. And this comes to show how important also the statistics of archaeology is. When you have 38 sherds versus 300,000, that tells you a lot about the activity in the ports. And so it's not only a matter of not only focusing on text, but really taking the full availability of the archaeological material into account. And what we then see is that actually there is very little Greek or Roman pottery or tradeware that made it to India. Whereas in East Africa, the Roman ports in Egypt and also in the Mediterranean, we find a lot of Indian material. So the archaeology seems to say there's much more export coming from India, and much sooner than the Roman Empire, than there were ever any Romans coming to India. And some of this, of course, still dates back to 19th century biases, but it is in our project we were very surprised how deeply rooted this is, and we really are interested in facts. So sites like this, like Maritime, do really benefit from another look and using modern techniques like XRF, where you can really determine the provenance of pottery. So this is also something we have been doing recently. Here you see some results of mineral studies and XRF studies done by myself and one of the master students, now a PhD student in the project, Daniele Giamperen, who has studied a site in Oman, which was well known as a Roman trade site, like Archaeology. And he and the Italian team that has always worked there went to investigate and used XRF to actually see what the provenance was. And it turned out that over 80%, over 58% of the pottery was actually from India, made from soil from the Indian subcontinent. So it completely, again, changed the perspective of the port. And the buildings in the port were not Roman either, but the amphora and the pottery was actually all imported from India, which makes the Indian subcontinent the main player in these networks in the east of the Arabian Peninsula. And this was really a game changer. And because of modern techniques like this, there is no doubt of the provenance. A lot of these pottery shirts and finds, they used to be determined on shape of rims. So you had experts who knew Roman pottery and they recognized the rim and then they said this is Roman. But with XRF, you look at the mineral properties of the soil, and this is different in many different countries. So there is no doubt that even if a pot looks slightly similar, you can exactly know where it is from. And so this is quite a game changer, again, in our perspective. And here in Western universities, British universities, people are always very surprised when we say actually it was Indian. And from the Maurya period onwards, we see this happening. We see this much larger incentive of trade actually coming from the Indian subcontinent. And so we're hoping to do a lot more research like this. We were planning to over the last 2 years, but because of the pandemic, a lot of the data sets were no longer accessible. But the pottery is very old. It will still be there in a few years, so we hope we can pick this up. And by doing this in large amounts, with large amounts of pottery, you actually have statistically viable databases where you can actually see these patterns of trade. And more that we do this, the more it becomes evident that not only was the ancient Indian subcontinent a crossroad, it was also very much an incentive. So a lot of the international trade started from there. And this should not be such a surprise. A lot of pottery also from Egypt and further south, the African coast, and these are some that are much older. They have not been XRF'd. A lot of them were also Indian, or they had Indian inscriptions. So even you see here pottery with Indian inscriptions, or they're made from India and they have an Arabian inscription. We have Arabian pottery with Brahmi on it. So it seems these goods exchange a lot of hands. Of course, it's a long distance. They go to different ports. But among all this variety, there's always a lot of either Indian inscriptions or pottery to be found. And traditionally, researchers like to categorize everything very neatly, say this is a Roman pot and this is an Arabian pot, but we actually see much more of a mixture of these types coming together. And again, in Egypt, there are large depots, for example, in Birenike, with pottery that has never been studied with modern techniques. So we don't really know where it is from. And hopefully in the future, we could do similar research like in Oman. And I actually expect that quite a lot of these will also turn out to be Indian and much older than previously thought. Some of this very sporadically, so not in large amounts, has been done. There, not XRF, but there have been photomicroscopic research of some pottery examples that were found in Birenike in Egypt, and they were compared with the microscopic analysis of pottery in multiple sites in Gujarat in West India, and the composition was incredibly similar. Now, of course, this is still a comparative, an image comparison, but XRF would really point this out. And these kind of studies also really show, again, that we have very, very little Western material making it to India, but we have quite a large amount of Indian material being imported in East Africa and the Mediterranean region. And this is really something that is still missing in the literature. So for archaeologists, I think it's important to pick this up and to pursue this. Then when we look at the broader historical scope and looking for an explanation perhaps of why we see this, why is there so much Indian material going across the Indian Ocean? It actually makes perfect sense when you think of the Maurya Empire founded by Chandragupta, where also his famous advisor Kautilya in the Arthashastra writes. They have these specific new laws and guidelines in which international trade is actually mentioned as a means of diplomacy. To avoid conflict, which is the Arthashastra is a very remarkable text, unique in antiquity. It's one of the first law books in the ancient world, anywhere in the world, that talks about social equality, really laws of government, sort of a science of governance. So it is a very remarkable text. But the incentive to increase international trade is very actively pursued in some of the Ashokan edicts. This is also there. That's listed as an achievement. That there are very good ties with the Seleucid Empire or the Parthians in Persia, in the west of India, and trade was actively pursued. Sometimes, as one passage in the Arthashastra also says, it was even a good way to spy on your neighbors, because you send merchants in, and then you learn what's going on, and you avoid large wars and conflicts. So politically, it actually makes a lot of sense that from this period, from 300, from the time of Chandragupta, we do also in the archaeological record really see this large increase of trade across the Indian Ocean. And mixing these historical sources with the archaeology, I think, is very interesting, and it starts to make a lot more sense than saying 300 years later the Romans introduced trade. These texts say otherwise, and so does the archaeology. And as a result, it seems more we look also at monumental and architecture from that time in India itself, it really seems that international trade also brought a lot of a great diversity of people to India itself. Here on the slide are several portraits from a stupa in the ancient Gandhara region in the north, now in Pakistan, Swat Valley near Taxila. This one was found. And these Buddhism, of course, becomes very widespread when Ashoka becomes officially a Buddhist and a patron. And you see in his capitals in Gandhara a lot of monumental Buddhist architecture. And interestingly, they often coincide with trade locations. So stupas, Buddhist imagery and symbolism often are found at port sites or sites where there is also evidence of trade. And this is also something that Rishika and I are looking at this correlation between Buddhism and ancient trade. Could there also be really a relationship or even a causation somewhere in this overlap? But at these stupas, whenever a patron, usually a rich person, donated money to the stupa for an extra turret or a bit of paint, they would leave a portrait of themselves and an inscription so that people knew they had done this. And very often this was done by rich merchants who wanted to win goodwill from the people so that they could trade with them. And we see this is all from one stupa, and unfortunately the British archaeologists cut off all the statues and they're scattered in museums across Europe. It's very hard to reconstruct this. A lot of these Gandharan reliefs were cut off and the Buddha statues were taken off, and most of them are in the British Museum. And all of them, you can see them cut off on the back. So a lot of art historians here in the West don't even know that they are part of stupa reliefs. So there's also still a lot that archaeologists need to put right there. But what you see here, of course, is a very wide variety of people. We see Kushan, a lady leading a caravan. Here, some faces that look very Mediterranean, Roman or Greek. We see people with turbans, we see Arabian traders. So we have all these people coming together on one stupa. So not only the pottery evidence, but also examples like this really emphasize this. Now, and interestingly, rather than this focus on Roman trade, one of the other PhDs in our project, Samatar Botan, is looking at the African kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia, which came at a rise at around 100 BC, at the same time as the Han dynasty in the east. And lasted a very, very long time until the Islamic invasions in Africa in around 900, and then it was destroyed. But until that time, throughout almost the entire first millennium, Aksum was a very big player in trade, and this has been also very neglected. This kingdom in Africa, very little research exists, but what we do have shows that actually there is more Aksumite material in India than there is Roman material. And so this would indicate that the exchanges between Aksumite traders and Mauryan and later on Kushan and Gupta traders in the first millennium actually was much more numerous than Roman trade ever was, even though that is where most scholars were focused on. Here you see some Aksumite pottery also found in Gujarat, and this is also something that we hope to explore more in the future, where, for example, Rishika's PhD and Samatar's PhDs can overlap. We were planning on some archive studies again before COVID happened, but this now has to wait. And unfortunately, there is a civil war in Ethiopia right now. So also that is a reason why we cannot access some of the material. But hopefully we can still do what we can. Also interesting, found in Aksum, now in a private collection somewhere in the United States, and we don't know where, unfortunately, but it has been recorded, actually several large hoards of Kushan coins from India were found in Aksum. So it's not only Aksumite ware being traded to India, we also see gifts like this, evidence really of exchange of from the Kushan period, so the first couple of centuries CE, with Kushan kings inscriptions on it that made it to Aksum. So that really is a very interesting line of investigation that we hope to pursue in the future. So against that background of maritime trade, I will now briefly zoom in on one specific category of material. And we looked at pottery very briefly so far, but I think a very interesting material type where archaeologists can actually learn a lot in these patterns are beads. Very, very small beads. Here you see several quite recent finds from Egypt, found in Berenike near the harbor temple and near the large ports. And a lot of research in beads is often much more technologically advanced than pottery studies still are. A lot of XRF is going on, and with glass manufacture, you can actually determine the shaping and the technique that was used. Of course, glass is made also of sand, so there's quartz, mica, these kind of properties. How much is in it says a lot about where it is made. And we do know that a lot of beads like these are particularly unique for Sri Lanka and the southern parts of the Indian subcontinent. They're generally called Indo-Pacific beads. This is a name someone has once given to these types of beads. And I mean, there are some separate studies, some case studies that have been published about them, but there is not really an overview. And at first in our project, we were like, oh, more beads, nice. But gradually we came to notice that actually these Indian beads are incredibly numerous and they are everywhere. I think really these were a large part of some of the export from the Indian subcontinent. Of course, there's also the spices and the herbs and cinnamon and pepper and curcuma and all this. And most of the trade ware was food, some pigments, smaller things, and luxury items were quite rare. But beads, glass beads, were incredibly popular. And there was something about these that somehow made them wanted across the ancient world, and not only in Egypt. Interesting is that ancient Egyptian beads were usually made of faience. So faience is a different type of glass. And in the south of India, they had a different technique so that glass is more luminous. And this, people seem to like this. So it could also be an aesthetic preference that traders from India, they cashed in on it, so to speak. They realized that these beads were popular. They're easy to make, and we see them in huge amounts. Here, some XRF results from all these kind of beads from another port in the south of Egypt, Nios Hormuz. Later, it became an Islamic port, Qasr al-Kadim. This excavation is from different time layers, and in all these layers, from antiquity until early Middle Ages, we keep seeing beads from South India, Sri Lanka, and South Asia. So this is first, all this research was in Egypt, because a lot of work is being done in Egypt and not so much in the rest of East Africa. But that is happening more and more. And everywhere, every new site that is discovered, we find again these Indo-Pacific beads. Here a site actually only discovered about a decade ago in as far south as Mozambique. So all the way down, even below Tanzania, Kenya. We have a site in Mozambique where previously the historians always believed it was only the arrival of the Islamic traders that there was any international trade at all. But at this site, Chibinue in Mozambique, they've also found Roman glass, Indo-Pacific beads that are much older. So again, this indicates that even Southeast African countries had a trade connection, and that again there was quite a strong import factor from the Indian subcontinent that we can see here. Now the fact remains that simply a lot of ports in East Africa have never been excavated. No work has been done there. This also has roots in colonial rule in the 19th century when Egypt was very popular, but the rest of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, was not considered civilized in antiquity, and so no campaigns were done. Of course, now there is a lot of interest also from universities in Nairobi, in Kenya, for example. They have projects, and I think this is very much an up-and-coming field. And I would predict that the more African archaeology would happen, there would also be many more finds from India, like beads, foodware being traded, even as far south as this. Now, the beads on this slide are from our project's own data set. They are surface finds from the island of Zanzibar off the coast of Tanzania, which is in Islamic periods, so early medieval times, it is well known to be a sort of a trade crossroads for ocean trade. But again, it makes a lot of sense that this already happened sooner. And again, here on the beaches, on many of the port sites, do we not only find Islamic beads, we find a lot of these glass beads that are very particular for the south of India and Sri Lanka. And these are some images from our microscopes. We have an XRF here now where we have these materials. We definitely plan on XRFing this and publishing this, which again really opens up this connection between India and Africa much sooner than in antiquity the Romans and in medieval times the Islamic traders. So there is a lot of evidence here. And I think where, of course, the individual finds are interesting, it's especially when you have many of them and you connect these sites on a map. Like even just for Africa, we have these finds going all the way from Alexandria, in fact, all the way down to Mozambique and Zanzibar. So there is a huge continuity of Indian ware, and these beads are a great example of this. That continues, and that is how large amounts of archaeology can show these patterns that right now are still missing in the history books. And this is why facts and modern techniques are very important, because it changes our understanding. And in this case, I think India was much more active and prominent in these ancient routes than they were presumed. Interestingly, the last part on these beads is that even much later in the Byzantine period, so we're really in medieval times, a lot of these beads are still very popular. And many of these will have been reused. Beads last for a long time. We do see that from the Gupta period onwards, there seems to be gradually less trade across the oceans, and we see more trade by land. But even in here in Byzantine times, here you see from a mosaic in Ravenna in Italy, we have particular fashion where the Byzantines liked to wear to sew beads onto their clothing. And here you see examples of that from also graves that were found And many of these beads are actually Indian beads. And so this is quite remarkable, and many of the archaeologists working on this were not aware of it. They would just call them small green beads. But by comparing these data sets, it actually shows that they last very long. And even here in a grave, a Merovingian grave in France, a lot of these Indian beads have been found. And a colleague of mine here at university focuses on Merovingian graves, which is completely different topic than what we do in our project. But because she had the Indian beads and I have Indian beads from different time periods, we started to compare, and we actually see that these patterns continue for a long time. And so that is how even something as small as beads, because we can identify them so well with modern techniques, really help us to redraw the map and to gain new insight into how the world was actually connected, and that the role of India actually was very prominent in this. So for the last case study, we will turn from the sea, and we're going inland, and I would like to briefly highlight, because this is a recent project, I could talk quite long about this, but I will not do this, about the importance of, again, the crossroad function of India for land routes. So here on the slide, as you can see, drawings of several petroglyphs, rock art that are found in the northern Himalayas, Karakoram Mountains, in current-day Pakistan, which were, of course, part of the ancient Indian empires like Gupta, Kushan, and Maurya. And many of those sites are now in Pakistan. Some decades ago, German teams have done some work in this area, and some catalogs have been published with rock art. There are some inscriptions. All of these are in Kharosthi or Brahmi. A lot of Buddhist imagery. But apart from just the catalogs, very little research has been done. And this is something that me and two other members of the project have recently also looked at, and we tried using the rock art in the same way as we use the pottery and the beads to trying to reconstruct these routes. Very interestingly, this also again links Buddhism with trade activity, because it seems, and we can date some of the rock art quite well by the inscriptions, where, for example, Kushan kings are mentioned. Here on the slide, you see, this is very recently, this is a picture taken last year. You see some of the stupas, and here inscription under the Buddha figure. We can date them, and it actually shows that Buddhist imagery made it to China long before a lot of the texts from China mention that monks traveled to Pataliputra, the Gupta capital. But long before that, Buddhism was already introduced through these trade routes. And very interesting as well, which you can see better probably here on this image, is that the stupas, the Buddhist stupas we see carved on the rocks, they really follow the architectural scheme of some of the earliest known stupas from the Gandhara region, even from the time of Ashoka in the Maurya period, where you see this round, the round domes with these discs on top. Here you see miniature Gandhara stupa. Even the rosettes and the decorations are carved into the rock, and they're very recognizable as typical Gandharan architecture. And it seems that rather than building these stupas in the mountains while you travel, it's very rugged terrain, of course, that at important nodal points along the route, stupas were carved so that Buddhist travelers could worship while they were traveling. But we also find Hindu iconography here at one of our sites. We found it's not a very good picture, not yet. We're working on a drawing of it, but here and in the inscription it can be read. We see Krishna and Balarama, his brother, Krishna with the chakra, and their names are actually written here. It says Krishna and Balaram. So we also have evidence of Hindu iconography in these mountains. This is at the site of Chelas. So apart from trade route evidence and also a lot of goats and hunting scenes, there's so many goats on this mountain. This is also important for religious history of the Indian subcontinent, and particularly as early as Maurya and Gupta periods. So, well, by far most of it is Buddhist. We are not sure yet. We haven't translated all the inscriptions. There may well be more Hindu iconography as well. So, some of our recent publications on this work. Here you see one of my publications, and collaborative. Very recently published at Oxford. They're all in open access. I'd be happy to send links to them as well, where we use these rock art data to trying to reconstruct the roots. But we also, in the Oxford publication, we've tried to identify some of the Buddhist iconography, like very famous bodhisattvas are recognized, and we compare them with Indian iconography from other well-known sites. And it's quite surprising that very little work has been done on this. And one of my colleagues from Pakistan, a young archaeologist, Abdul Ghani Khan, is also leading the fieldwork there. And he wants to become also a specialist on Buddhist rock art. So this is, I think, a very interesting new potential sites also, where a lot of work can still be done. Again, modern techniques are very important here, not just to photograph the rock art, but to actually determine the distribution patterns. So here are some of the distribution maps that we have made, and by looking at different animal carvings, Buddhist carvings and inscriptions, by doing this for all the sites, we really started to recognize these patterns of places where most likely, for example, a station post would be, where people would stay the night. So there are clear intervals for travel, which makes sense, and they all follow the river, mostly the Indus River, which also makes sense that you want to stay near water when you travel all the way to China. Now, from the Chinese end, unfortunately, no research is done, because, of course, Pakistan only has a part of the Karakoram highway, and a large part of it falls into Chinese territory, and there must be many more rock art there. They have never been studied, but hopefully this may be something that can be done in the future, but it would have to be quite a complex exchange of different countries and scholars working together. And one of the issues as well is that many of the Pakistani scholars are not experts in the Brahmi or the Kharosthi texts. So it would be quite complex to put India, China, and Pakistan all together. But we kind of need expertise from experts from everywhere for this complex region. But so far, also due to the pandemic, travel has been very difficult. We now have a team of young archaeologists from Pakistan. You see some of them here, who last year went to two new sites that we identified in the mountains, Allen Bridge and Chelas, and they tried to document as many of the carvings as possible. Getting permits for this kind of work is very difficult in Pakistan. Drones are forbidden, modern equipment we were not allowed to use, so we just use GPS for the coordinates and documentation. But there was also quite some urgency in this project involved because, as you see here, unfortunately, there is a lot of vandalism and destruction of the Buddhist rock art in many parts of these mountains. This is why we had a grant from the Prins Claus Fund for Cultural Development as a rescue operation. A lot of these Buddhist art, you see here a stupa has been vandalized and all of these have been destroyed. This is out of superstition, where a lot of the villagers there, they are not aware it is Buddhist, and they have destroyed and damaged a lot of these iconography. So Ghani and I, we made a workshop for these local villages, and we explained that these rock art are 2,000 years old and they are pre-Islamic. They are important heritage, and actually the response was very good. And we tried to say there could be tourism revenue. And with some of the local authorities, we made some of these sites now archaeological sites, so they are better protected. Apologies. But this is still, this happens across the mountains. So unfortunately, even though these rock art are incredibly interesting and there's a lot still to discover on these routes that really led from India to the early dynasties in China, there is a lot of destruction. Also, in a couple of years, a large dam will be built near Chilas, which will flood the entire valleys. So the rock art that we documented will be inaccessible in a couple of years, and we can't rescue it because we can't take the rocks out. But we will hopefully still this year publish our catalog with all the drawings, all the photographs, and all the inscriptions in open access, so that scholars everywhere in the world will be able to study them. And we are talking with the Prins Claus Fund, which is from the Dutch royal family. They give money for this. That we could do another campaign, so we could potentially preserve more sites. So in this case, it's not just the interpretation, but also the sort of emergency to preserve the archaeology, so we can still study it even when it is gone. We had maritime trade, we had land trade, a lot of work in both cases that still needs to be done. But as to round off, before I end up talking forever, we're nearly at an hour. But I had one example which I think is very interesting for potential future prospects. And this brings us to another island in the Indian Ocean called Socotra, which is south of Yemen, which also means that at the moment getting permits for research is very difficult. There's a very large conflict and war going on there. And of course, also a pandemic. But hypothetically, this is a very, very interesting site that has not really been explored very well. Several years ago, a group of Belgian cave explorers, geologists, went to this island because they were interested in the geology. And in one of the caves, they found a lot of inscriptions and drawings in the rocks from traders from Arabia, Ethiopia, inscriptions in the Geze script, Palmyrene, all kinds, but also from India. So here you see clear inscriptions, and this was very remarkable, we here have stupa carvings that look very, very similar to some of them we have in the Karakoram Mountains. So the images here are from Socotra, see the stupa, and these are some of the small stupas from the Karakoram Mountains in the Himalayas. And so again, and it seems to be from the time of the Kushans, we have evidence of trade and Buddhism making it all the way to East Africa. And we're not entirely sure, but these stupa images here on Socotra may well be some of the earliest introduction of Buddhism to the West. And this, of course, also again emphasizes the active role of Indian traders and Indian sailors by ships going to East Africa. And not all of these inscriptions have been studied well or documented. And ideally, there could even be a maritime project on Socotra. There could be shipwrecks. There could be all kinds of material in these caves, pottery, that could again lead to more information about the active role of India in these trade networks. This would be very difficult. I have talked with some colleagues here at the faculty who specialize in robotics and maritime archaeology, and this could be possible. We now have techniques that there are sort of waterproof robots that are sent down into a cave and who can survey it and see what's out there. But of course, we would have to get permits and fieldwork would have to be possible. But I think it is already a very remarkable find, and to see these stupa carvings that are so similar to what we see in the Karakoram, you only really see this when you try to look at trade sites on so many different areas, to really look at it trans-regionally and not focus on only one site. So that again, to come back to these main points that I started with that are very important in our project, is to connect different sites as far as Socotra and the Himalayas in Pakistan, and to see the importance of archaeological data, how often it tells us so much more or different things than textual sources can do, and also how statistically viable it often is compared to texts, and how this helps us introduce new sites and new areas of interest, like our pattern studies in the Himalayas made us find new sites like Allen Bridge. And so far, we've collaborated with quite a few people, and we're very open to pursuing this. Of course, if you're interested in so many different countries, and I am from the Netherlands myself, it stands to reason that you reach out to experts from these countries, and that you can compare data, and like we have done with our Prince Claus Fund, is from the Netherlands, but we work with archaeologists in Pakistan, and this works incredibly well, I think, for a global academic community. So on that note, I am, of course, very curious about your views and input, and I'm delighted to be able to present some of our work. We're all very enthusiastic about it. I think that is quite clear. But the more we find, the more intriguing actually these routes, especially for the Indian subcontinent, really are. And I think it's always valuable to try to understand the reality of the past rather than the narratives that we write about it. And I very much look forward to learning a lot more in the future. So before with the questions on our project website, which I've listed here, archaeologistconnected.org, all our recent open access publications can also be downloaded. So we make sure that when they are available in PDF, we will put them on there, and they can be widely shared. Of course, I can also be reached through my email, and I'm always happy to connect. So again, thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope that the talk was of interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Aerde, for this fascinating presentation. I think in the last 1 hour, we learned so many new things about which we were not aware. And I think you're doing some very original research, which is an ongoing project. You already uncovered many facts which we did not know. And you would, I'm sure, in future, this project will also throw up a number of interesting finds. But what I found really interesting and fascinating was your observation that India was globally connected through trade very intensely and densely 300 years before the Roman came around. So that's a very interesting uh, insight. And also this your focus on the beads, that's also very interesting. I'm sure these beads were going in women's jewelry, and that's why they were so popular, perhaps more popular than the other things that you have mentioned here. It's quite possible.